Today I will talk about electromechanical coupling in electroactive polymers, visual analysis of third-order tensor field. And the first question that arises is, what is a tensor? A tensor is an algebraic object that describes a multilinear relationship between sets of algebraic objects related to a vector space. Sounds complicated, but we can look at it from a different perspective. A zeroth-order tensor can be represented as scalar, a first-order tensor as vector, a second-order tensor as matrix, and as higher as the order of the tensor becomes, as more complex becomes the structure that represents the tensor. The second question that arises is, what is an electroactive polymer? And an electroactive polymer is a material that changes its shape under the influence of an electric field. Here you can see a lens, a bi-inspired tunable lens, um, that is attached on the outer radius. Electrodes are attached to the black surface of the lens, and the upper half of the lens is loaded by applying a difference in the electric potential. And as the material is nearly incompressible, the inner radius changes, and so the curvature of the actual lens changes, which results in the known lens effect. We are looking at two different examples, one perfectly spherical and one with a little defect in the shape, so it has an elliptical shape. This example can be described by the coupling tensor. It is a tensor that describes the sensitivity of mechanical stresses with respect to the electric field. And it is a three-dimensional third-order tensor, so there would be 27 values, but due to the left-minus symmetry, there are only 18 values. There are many problems that come with these higher order tensors, and the first one, of course, is that there are too many values to analyze per hand. And even if it would be possible to analyze these per hand, it wouldn't help that much because they are highly dependent of the coordinate system. Another problem is that there is no standard tensor decomposition, like for example in the second order case, the spectral decomposition. So today we're looking at a different tensor decomposition, the deviatoric decomposition. It decomposes a tensor in irreducible and orthogonal parts. Orthogonal means that rotation of each of these parts results in the rotation of the complete tensor. And irreducible means that it cannot be decomposed further into smaller parts with this property. How does this decomposition look like? We have our tensor and it is split into the symmetric and the asymmetric part. For the asymmetric part, we need an isomorphism from the totally symmetric tensors of lower order onto the asymmetric tensors. And then we can use for these totally symmetric tensors the well-known relationship between spherical harmonics and these tensors to decompose them into a set of deviators. Deviators are totally symmetric and traceless tensors, and the nice thing here is that each of these can be represented uniquely by a set of vectors and one scalar. The vectors are called multipoles. And this is how the decomposition looks like for the coupling tensor. We have the asymmetric part with a deviator of second order and a deviator of first order, and we have the symmetric part with a deviator of third order and a deviator of first order. So in total we have 18 independent values. There are different interpretations for the multipoles, and the first one is the electromechanical interpretation, where each of these mathematical multipoles represent one multipole known from the field of electromechanics. And so it describes the load of the material. And the second interpretation is the symmetrical interpretation, where the intersection of symmetries of each of the multiple sets represents the symmetry of the complete tensor. And we used these multipoles to design a glyph. And the glyph is very basic, as the main part is to understand these tensors in more detail. We used tubes to represent the multiples, and these tubes have a fixed length. The color represents the norm of the irreducible part, so it describes the influence of the deviator for the complete tensor, and we used split view for a better overview. This is how it looks like for the lens example. Yeah, in first it looks a little bit confusing, but we can look at it in more detail. First, analyzing the color, we can see that these two deviators of higher order, or the irreducible part of the higher order deviators, do not have influence on the complete tensor, as they are much smaller than the norms of the two um, first order deviator parts. And then we can see that the orientation of the multiples of the deviators of first order have the same orientation. So in total, for this example, we can say that the third order tensor can be nearly described by one vector and two scalars. And if we look at the imperfect lens, we can see pretty much similar results. We can see a little change of the norm of the irreducible parts, and if we would analyze the orientation of the multiples in more detail, we would see that the angle of the first order deviators change very, very little. So we can analyze the norms in more detail, and we can see that the major changes are in the symmetric part. So by now we don't know what this means, but we can analyze the results mathematically. Let's summarize. We have vanishing deviators, the two deviators of higher order. The tensors can be nearly represented by two vectors and two scalars. And these two vectors have the same orientation, and the most change of the shape, the change of the shape affects the symmetric part mostly. So we have to analyze what this means mathematically. Here you can see how the coupling tensor is calculated. It doesn't matter what is written here in detail. We just have to see that the Cauchy-Green tensor and the electric field are important. And we can set the electric field fixed, as the orientation or the coordinate system does not matter. And then we can calculate reverse. So we can analyze what does it mean if we have some special properties for the Cauchy-Green tensor. And for example, in this lens example, this is the result. So we have two vanishing deviators, and the two first order deviators have the same orientation. Then the Cauchy-Green tensor is given by this. The changes of the material are only in direction of the main axis, and you can see that the change in x and y direction is the same. With this knowledge gained from the visualization, we now can analyze which deviations from the perfect shape would be tolerable without influencing the function of the lens. And this knowledge can then again be used for other types of defects. We know this is just the first step into the direction of analyzing tensors of higher order, but it is the first method to analyze an arbitrary tensor of higher order visually and understand them in more detail. And with this, I will close my talk and will be happy to answer your questions.